Could you go to the next slide there? Click the arrow. All right. You have them in front of the award. The Global Citizen Award recognizes individuals that have provided exemplary thought leadership and substantive worldwide contributions in promoting informed and responsible use of geographic information, geospatial technologies for the benefit of humanity, and for fostering spatial data infrastructure developments that support sustainable, social, economic, and environmental systems integrated from local to global scales. Jacqueline is a truly exceptional global citizen. She has served the needs of others internationally and globally by leading the European Environmental Agency through a challenging 10-year period of rapid growth in membership and resources to address environmental issues across the agency's now 32 member states, while participating in environmental projects and initiatives in 60 countries globally. By recognizing the value of citizen science and crowdsourcing for encouraging direct citizen participation in collecting and disseminating environmental information. Strongly advocating new technologies to improve information gathering, analysis, integration, and dissemination at local, national, and global levels. Fostering systems to provide citizens with access to environmental information, including the Eye on Earth in 2008, recognized in the 2012 Rio Plus 20 Summit Declaration as a key public information platform on the environment, and currently leading the Eye on Earth Alliance and Network, which aims to become a global public information service, bringing together knowledge communities around the world to share data and information and to help build sustainable solutions for the future. As a result of her fervent belief in the value of collecting and integrating environmental information at local, national, and global levels, and her drive in creating the means to share that information with the global community, especially citizens, our planet has a better chance of surviving the environmental challenges ahead. In service to the discipline, in the betterment of lives of others, and in friendship, the GSTI Association hereby recognizes Jacqueline McGlade as an exemplary global citizen.
Extraordinary. Thank you very much. It's a great, great honor to be here and to be recognized in this way. And I really have to say that in my new role, I've just moved to UNEP to work in Nairobi. I hope that we can actually extend what we did in the last 10 years in a European perspective out into the global setting. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm really delighted to be working now, certainly on the continent of Africa, but extending out to all the global communities that we began our discussions with when I started in the IONS discussions. So this morning, I thought that I would actually rather make the use case about why and what's happening in the world, and how, in fact, spatial enablement can truly transform what we're trying to do on a day-to-day basis when it comes to sustainable development and poverty reduction. And in a way, we have an amazing opportunity. We're at a crossroads as we sit before a whole discussion around how we will move from the Millennium Development Goals towards the Sustainable Development Goals, the post-2015 agenda as it's known. And so it's about how we're going to live in the future on planet Earth. And so the first thing I'm going to just quickly touch on is how we understand now sustainability and prosperity, because the dialectic, the discussion, has completely changed compared to, say, 10 years ago. We also realize that in today's changing world, we have to transform the way that we respond to change. Some might call it an increase in emotional intelligence. There's certainly a need for greater social intelligence. I'm going to talk about how the way that we interact with each other around maps, but also around data and knowledge, can really be a vital part of making that transformation a smooth transition instead of a series of bumpy rides and changes that disrupt much of society. I'm going to talk about collective knowledge, creating individual efforts and then linking them up to build a collective intelligence, and then finally about how we actually create what I'm calling a regenerative economy. Some people have called it the green economy, the transition from the brown economy, but I think the regenerative economy is how we can best consider it. Now this morning we heard about the way in which The Economist, for example, changed his opinion from the hopeless continent where there were wars and famine and many, many natural disasters towards this idea of Africa rising. And in fact, one has to ask, what made that change? What made that difference? And of course, from The Economist's point of view, it has very much to do with the normal business of governments, the change in GDP, the emergence of the middle class, the way in which social values were changing. But I want to give you a different picture. And I want to really say to you that we have to think again about what development means, both from those who are in the donor community and those who are in the recipient world. And on the left-hand side, you can see a map just come out from UNDP on the Human Development Index. And this takes into account many, many social characteristics to do with health, education, living conditions, and so on. Now you'll notice, of course, that there's a big difference in many ways between the left and the right. What the right represents is a new concept, well, not so new, it's been around for at least 4 or 5 years, in active terms, in terms of calculations, the material footprint. Some of you will have heard about the ecological footprint, but the material footprint is really the tracker for how many countries in Africa need to really keep a very careful eye on their resources and what's happening across borders. So you'll notice, in fact, that of course many, many countries within the African setting have a rather low material footprint, that's the green colour, and there are some countries, particularly 1 or 2 in the Middle East, but more generally across the world, which are moving into much higher material footprint. Now what does a material footprint look like? Well, what it really represents, in fact, is the flow of goods, particularly materials, virgin materials, more than anything, from one place to another. It's a measure of the movement across borders, of exports and imports. But what it also does, it tries to look at the environmental impacts of actually generating those materials. So for example, we know that there were 70 billion tons of material goods traded around the world. But to actually get those 70 billion tons traded, we actually had to use up 40% in terms of local resources. So no matter when we look at the trade figures, it looks as if there's an awful lot going on around the world. If you look at the countries on the left, and if you can see, it's a little bit difficult in this picture, but you can see there's a sweeping curve from the left, which is in principle the domestic extraction, down to the material footprint. You'll notice that there are many countries that are high on the left, i.e. they are where the resources come from, but their actual use, their footprint, is down here on the left. So we have a fundamental choice facing us for development, because clearly, if many of those countries who are providing resources continue along the same development paradigm that we've had, which is to, in fact, increase our material footprint, then we will not have a sustainable future. And one of the only ways that we can anticipate being able to do that is to decouple and to change the way in which production and intensification occurs in the future. One way to do it, and I have to say that my own continent has done that very, very well, is to shift it. So you can say that Europe has a very eco-efficient industry base, but in fact it's because it shunted it somewhere else. Now, if we're going to take a step back and look at what development means, keeping track of those numbers, where and exactly the resources are extracted, where they are processed, where they are consumed, means that we will fundamentally change the whole model of how we look at consumption. Now, the statistical offices are very good at looking at trade across borders, but now what we're saying is that there's another kind of statistics that will come in, which is geolocated and highly specific to where particular resources come from. And so you can see that, of course, Europe has started to do on the left-hand side what we call decoupling. In other words, growth continues, but the use of resource does not grow at the same rate. And in fact, we can even see some absolute decoupling, which is very encouraging. But of course, now we ask the question, what does it really look like? And we find, of course, that we see that, quite honestly, a lot of what is happening in the European side is shunting this demand and consumption to elsewhere. Now, it has tremendous policy implications, and every part of this graph and every part of this diagram demands and requires high quality data. In fact, more than anything, industry is really seeing the benefits of life cycle analysis from their individual sites all the way up to how they will now calculate global flows and even things such as the Carbon Disclosure Project, the Water Disclosure Project. These are demands on industry for site-specific use of resources that then get put into the supply chain and ultimately into the calculation of the material footprint. So there's much ahead of us in terms of how we're going to account for a use of resources. We can also measure the environmental impacts both locally, but again we need highly specific information, geolocated, because quite honestly, if it's water, it's not easily transportable, but it is easily transportable within crops, within products. So this is where, in fact, we need to be able to bring together environmental data, geospatial data, and trade data. And fundamentally, the model of development can no longer rely on these simple statistics that we've had in the past. We now need to add more layers of knowledge about actually what is happening. So a very, very simple model, of course, is to put the economy in the middle, not on the outside, supported by the Earth's resources. And so we have on the table in front of member countries a new thinking about what is the development model all about. If we're going to address poverty eradication, certainly poverty reduction, if we're going to address what I would call the inequalities of wealth, the inequalities of income, and certainly within the Human Development Index we have to think even about education, then a kind of new model has begun to emerge. And what it has, which is different, are two particular elements. And I'll come back to those, but one is how we deal with capital assets, how we quantify them, and how we then place them in the market, of course. But also the other one is about how our definition of well-being will also need to change. The idea of the concept of well-being and happiness being truly connected to how we see our needs being defined. Now, in the sort of coming time, we're going to be able to do a lot on monetizing, quantifying, looking at the quality of the capital assets. And what is very encouraging is that here in Africa, under the Gaborone discussion and the declaration, a series of countries have come together in Africa to actually produce the first set of natural capital accounts. And these accounts are going to give for the first time countries a sense of what they actually have, the wealth that they have at their fingertips. So, not only looking at biodiversity, but also looking at mining of underground resources, the geology, the water, and so on. And that capitalization has been picked up by the World Bank in a project called Waves. It's all about the wealth and the value of services, ecosystem services. But here comes the rub. It's politically very interesting, politically very engaging, and of course people want to understand what the assets are that they have and how valuable they are and how they're going to monetize them, to trade, look at trade incentives, look at leveraging, put a fiscal reform in, and so on. But they need data to do that. And so this is a community at large that will be used, I would think, even more heavily in the future to try to come up with spatial accounts for resources at the global, at the national, and at the very local level. So if we were thinking about water, we're really going to have to face the kind of standards, the discussion that OGC is having about HTML water. These are going to be vital when we come to discuss where water is abstracted from and where it is used. And there's a genuine problem that if we want to do ecosystem accounts for water, we're going to have to work at the river basin level, which means, of course, that we're going to have to do lots of trans-border international discussions. So these natural capital accounts are not without, I would say, some challenges. But it is extremely encouraging that from all over the world, it is the African countries who have realized that to fulfill the Africa Rising rhetoric, they're actually going to have to put numbers on the table. So I would see that this if there was one area that our collective work could really support, it should be in this, because this is the way that a new development paradigm for the continent of Africa will genuinely, I think, become a reality. Now, moving on, transforming our responses to change. Here I would say that we have to increase our social intelligence. We've got to become smarter about how we deal with change, and more importantly, we also have to increase the way in which we share solutions. When I think about adaptation, climate adaptation, you can genuinely say that there are many, many, many out there. But what is stopping us, unfortunately, is the pervasive and systemic problems of inequality. And here there's a graph, again it's not quite so clear, but under the Ecology Trust, with just some countries, I didn't put all of them on here. But you can see that income inequality, despite the fact that we can see from the World Bank and others that more generally income inequality is sort of decreasing, you can look at each country within countries and you can see that the income inequality leads to some of the biggest problems that most governments are dealing with. It's dealing with, for example, life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage birth, trust, obesity, mental illness, social mobility. These are all linked to income inequality. It comes down to the neighbourhood in some cases, where neighbourhoods are, in a sense, marooned with a significant step down and step up around income. So whether we like it or not, we are not uniformly adaptable. We cannot assume that everybody is going to be able to adapt quickly. And I thought it would be interesting just to show you a series of pictures for the US, because even in one of the most developed countries of the world, there are problems coming. Let me just warn you. I mean, I'm sure many of you know that in the US, but it's interesting to look from outside. This is an analysis done by John Day and his team. So here's a picture of precipitation, and of course we know that it's going to change under climate change. We also know that it will have a fundamental effect on energy scarcity. So when we begin to look at the primary productivity across America, we can begin to see that there are some places which will continue to be very productive and others which will begin to fall away, where ecosystem services, because of the changing patterns of precipitation, will actually not perform as well. Now, in the US, there's a tremendous dependence in many places for intensive agriculture. That means you need to also have a lot of energy. If you put the two together, you begin to see quite a different pattern emerging. Now, if you couple that then, again, it's a little bit difficult, you can see the dark areas of the emerging mega regions. What this analysis also points out is that we are living through a myth when we say that cities are efficient places to live. It turns out that if you look at the pull of the mega regions on resources, it is now disproportionately higher than if you live in a rural community in America. So the kind of age-old thinking that if we put everybody into cities, we will get through economies of scale, efficiencies, turns out to not quite be right. And it's because when people find that things are available and maybe affordable, they buy more of them. So we actually are creating a kind of reinforcing mechanism to put a bigger imprint onto the American map. Now, I'm going to kind of hopefully get through the next two pictures. Could you just click it once more, please? This is what I think is the scary map of a US picture, because now you have a picture of what we call compromised sustainability. So here is an outcome of looking at ecosystem services that might not be quite so good as we thought they would. We can't rely on them. Combining with energy security and scarcity and so on. So I'm not saying move out of the Southwest, but quite honestly, you get a bit of a shock when you can see that there aren't quite so many places in the US where you might actually feel that you have sustainability at your fingertips. Now, our proposal is that we would like to do this analysis globally, because it's a genuine integrated thinking about how we will look at ecosystem services, climate change on the ground, the urbanization story, together with energy scarcity, and how we think we will be able to respond in the future. So it may simply be that the development paradigm of the past is something very different when we think about going forward in the future. How do we cope with that? Well, that's really the nub of this. We have to redefine our sentiments about what we think we need as opposed to what we perhaps perhaps really need. And sufficiency and many other discussions are taken up. But it is a genuine and very difficult political discussion, as I'm sure many of you in this room from Africa will truly appreciate. I'm not going to spend so much time on that now because I want to move on to really kind of more technical issues about our response in transforming how we will behave in the future. So in Europe we have a huge diversity of climate change signals and real changes. And as a result of that, I often say that Europe is a microcosm of what will happen around the world. As a result of it, we have a huge diversity of responses, whether it's in the wine industry, whether it's in the coastal areas where you can sort of see changes happening. You can find people coming up with solutions. And so I think more and more, as we try to develop our thinking about how we will respond to changes and transforming that into a smooth transition, we need to have better access to these kinds of locally based solutions. So that means we need to understand more of the context at each point, we need to contextualize solutions, and then we need to metadata tag those solutions so that other people can find them in multiple languages, in a way which is easy for people to really make the connections. And that for me is one of the biggest challenges. We also have to say that there's got to be more social intelligence. And whether it's living in a city and understanding that you're more at risk because of heat waves, or whether it's deciding you really are going to have a washing machine above your toilet. I'm not quite sure I've got to be on the side, not just as you were sitting there, but anyway, never mind. This really does exist. So it's the idea that we have to reshift our thinking about how we deal with resources. So yes, take that one home with you. So social intelligence is sometimes about saying to ourselves, what do we feel comfortable with? So how are we going to build this collective intelligence? Well, we have to do many, many things, and that's really what we're talking about here. Working in new ways together. We're going to be doing a lot more to do with sharing data and knowledge. Then I've got a different kind of dialogue here. So we're very, very good at cooperating with people who we know and who we like. And this is a lovely picture taken from a book about cooperation, where you can see that everyone's very calm, they all know what they've got to do, they're building a staircase, there's a guy in the middle who kind of looks like he's in charge, but everybody knows that they've got their bit to do. So this in a way is the idealised world of cooperation. All the tasks are divvied out, there's a leader, there's an outcome, there's a timetable, and we're on it. But actually today, we need to do more collaboration. And here's a fascinating story. This was the airplane that crashed, but where nobody died. And you could say it was because of the brilliance of the pilot. But in fact, he had thousands of people who had helped him land that airplane. There was the man who works for the US military, who spends all his lifetime throwing chickens into jet engines and seeing how they shred. Because of course, the thing that brought this airplane down was a bird strike. And so we now have engines that can pretty much survive birds flying into the engines. Then there are other people who are dealing with the fly-by-wire, and so on and so forth. So the fact that this airplane landed meant that this pilot, incidentally, had been collaborating with many, many people who perhaps even personally he may not know and probably may not even like. And that really will be our challenge, is that we're going to have to work more and more with individuals who we will never have met, and as I say, we may not even like. So that will be the future of collaboration. And so I have always had great regard for a man called Eric Whitaker, because he does something I think which we're trying to do. This is called the virtual choir, and he sends out a manuscript, a script, and gets hundreds of people to audition, and then like a kind of virtual choir, he stands and conducts, and they sing literally into the microphone via Skype and via any connection they can get. It is one of the most truly amazing things. You can hear it on YouTube, so I would certainly recommend you do it. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, in a sense, orchestrate people talking to us through hundreds and hundreds of virtual digital lines, trying to orchestrate it in a way where we can get something very harmonious out of it. And I think if he can make music, then I'm sure we can probably do the same. I'd like to move on now to what we're doing in UNEP. I told you I just arrived in UNEP in Nairobi about 5 weeks ago, and some of you will have heard about UNEP Live. What I'm trying to do over the next few few months, certainly the last 5 weeks, is to get UNEP Live up and alive. And so it's sort of up and living again. It will be a system-wide approach, certainly to begin with within the environment setting, because UNEP has had a fundamental change within its governance as a result of last year's Rio meeting, moving from a governing council with partial membership in terms of all the countries of the world to something called the Environment Assembly, the UNEA as it's known. And the UNEA, made up of the member countries, will now have to, in a sense, keep the environment under review and in a way make decisions and think about the environment and sustainable development as a whole. Now, supporting that activity demands a much, much higher level of quality of data, of more immediate and up-to-date access, of sharing. So it's just a completely different game that we are now involved in. And so as a result, what we're trying to do in UNEP, and real bridging gaps that have been there between some of the UN agencies, is to really transform the way that we do our business, the way we do our work, with citizens, with countries, with many stakeholders. So we're trying to lay the foundation. Could you just go back? We're trying to lay the foundation for really connecting all the individual efforts, whether they're citizen groups, ministries, or even regional bodies, industries, and so on, and really trying to connect those to create a collective intelligence. We want to have substantiated knowledge, but we want to deliver it through web services. The job is not for us to host and hold and have inventories of data and databases. No. This sticks back to the same principles of sharing information at source, so keeping information at source, collect it once, use it many times, authenticate it at source, find it at source, but make it available and make it easy to access it. And I think that's really our crucial kind of strapline here, is that we really want to look at our changing environment, place by place, people by people, organisation by organisation, country by country. And to do that, we will deploy open data, thinking about liquid data. We'll think about citizen and volunteer data, spatial information, web enablement, cloud-based, of course, big data, sense of web, common tagging, open standards. These are all things now that I have really set the basis for within the UNEP setting. So these are the kind of key things that we could spend endless days talking about, but just to tell you that they haven't gone away. And what we did, so to speak, in the European setting and in North America and then under Eye on Earth, I would really like to see embedded now within our work in UNEP. Next slide. So I'm afraid it's all washed out because the project is not very good, but it's a beautiful looking platform. Next slide. And on the left and on the right, I'll just tell you what's there. The idea is that countries will be able to access their data through the cloud or from their own site. You'll be able to see those national data sets, indicators, live data, hopefully quite a lot of mapping information, be able to make comparisons, country to country, create regional pictures as well. And the idea here is that there is diversity at the ends of the nodes, where the nodes are, but together at a UN level, we will have consolidated and at least many, many more harmonized data flows. And so at the very end, how do we use it? We're always asked about, well, what do you do with all these data and what do you do with the knowledge? So citizen science, in its own right, is a way of creating economics of people. It's about creating the way that we're going to invest in young people, entrepreneurs, and genuinely, next slide. I think that's why at the core of UNEP will be, of course, the support for member countries, but there will also be a very, very open hand through the My UNEP Live to citizen science programs, to indigenous peoples, to the major groups, but actually to you and me to try to really build society in a very different way. And I just want to show you these two examples. On the left is a very, very famous chef. He's a Brazilian, but he has transformed, in a way, what is happening in the Amazon by working through foraging and with people who live there, indigenous peoples, to actually say what you can eat, what's available, and what you want to put on the dish of an eco-tourist who's paid a lot of money to go to the Amazon. So he's a guy who can change entirely the rhetoric about biodiversity and the importance of biodiversity by simply saying he's going to talk about food. So here's a man who can sit on the front cover of Time magazine, but at the same time can actually help us protect the Amazon. And so through citizens participating, all their different walks of life, I believe that we can do a lot to create a different kind of future economy. On the right-hand side, this is about what we do as citizens, reusing, recycling, rethinking our use of resources on the planet. Next slide, please. And then how do we get young entrepreneurs to really mobilize? Well, one idea is to use the technology of using the white space to deliver internet into really remote rural areas, not just in Africa, but all around the world. And to combine that with renewable energy, 24-volt homes, and then to genuinely test it by saying, could you detect, if we set up small entrepreneurial activity, let's say for argument's sake in the middle of Africa, many, many, many miles away from even the nearest road, could you detect the difference between somebody there and a bad day in downtown Manhattan? And that's really the challenge. Can we create this kind of internet connectivity which will transform the migration of people moving into cities, which, remember, may not be as efficient as we thought. Keep them in their communities so that they don't have to move. So this kind of vision of mobilizing knowledge out across the continents is, I think, also at the core of what we're trying to do, not only within UNEP, but also more broadly. Last slide, please. And so I think reducing inequality, living sustainably, is really about putting two things together. One, looking under the waves, looking under the covers for how we can use resources in surprising places. And then, of course, investing in young people, and in particular, I have to say, young women.